The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to modifications to recreational accountability measures for the snapper, grouper, and dolphin wahoo fishery scoping session. I'm Brian Chevront with the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. Before we get going too far into this, I wanted to review some things about the council process so you'll know where we are at this point. In the beginning, when the council begins to do a fishery management plan, they do it as a result of a fishery management need being identified. And once it's been discussed basically at the council level, they decide to send it out to scoping, which is where they gather initial input from the public to see what they think about the topic and to allow the public to comment on how they think that the management issue needs to be addressed. Once that information has been gathered, the council will review all of the input and it'll develop management actions and alternatives. And once those management actions and alternatives have been developed and discussed over the course of a few meetings, the council will decide to have public hearings to allow the public to speak and give their opinions on what the council is proposing to do. Once the council receives the public hearing input, it'll modify the amendment, choose the preferred alternatives if it hasn't already done so, and then it'll work on the amendment until it is ready to be sent to the Secretary of Commerce for final approval. It's at that point that the public has its last opportunity to provide public comment at the council level. The council always takes public comment prior to the council voting to send the amendment in for approval. And it's done at that same meeting. But you can see where the red arrow is on this slide that the council is still pretty early in the process. There's a lot of work to be done on this amendment. So what the council is trying to do is at the beginning get your comments and input on whether or not the council needs to be addressing these issues and how you think the council might want to go about doing that. Now there's a scoping document that is a companion to this presentation, and a copy of this document can be downloaded on the website shown here on this slide. And the issues brought up in this presentation for you to consider are also in the scoping document. But the scoping document also provides additional detail that isn't necessarily being presented in this presentation. Now, the first area of action that the council is considering taking is modification of recreational accountability measures. Now, one thing I want to state up front is that the Magnuson-Stevens Act requires that there be accountability measures for all species for which that are managed by the council and have ACLs attached to them. Now, there's two types of accountability measures. The first kind are in-season accountability measures, and what that is basically things that happen when it appears that the council is about to reach its annual catch limit. An annual catch limit is what we used to refer to as a quota. In essence, an annual catch limit is the amount of fish that a sector is allowed to catch in any given season. So the most common type of in-season accountability measure is just basically to stop fishing for the rest of the year to prevent overfishing. The South Atlantic Council is interested in modifying in-season AAMs to try to prevent in-season closures and the disruptions that they cause for fishermen. The other type of accountability measures are called post-season accountability measures. And they are things that happen after the fishing season has closed, in which the sector has gone over its ACL, or annual catch limit. And things that are done are typically to reduce the length of the next fishing season, or perhaps to reduce future bag limits as a way to prevent too many fish from being caught in any given season in the future. So some of the issues, the big picture issues that are related to this is, do you think that accountability measures need to be modified, and if so, how? And what's most important in modifying accountability measures? And what criteria should the council use in changing those AMs? Now, some specific issues about AMs that the council would like your input on are, should the council eliminate in-season AMs simply because they cause disruption? Now, this would probably make sense for the recreational fishery and not so much for the commercial fishery, for the reasons about how the data are collected. And what post-season AM should the council use to address ACL overages? And how should landings estimate reliabilities factor into how and which AMs to apply? As you may know, that the estimates for recreational landings come from MRIP, which was previously known as MRFs. And for species that are caught pretty frequently, those estimates generally are fairly reliable. For less common species, the estimates of landings are less reliable. And so the council is trying to figure out, do they want to consider the differences in the reliability of the landings estimates in determining whether or how AM should be applied for those species? They would like to know what suggestions you have for ways to modify the AMs, and should the AMs only be applied if the total ACL is exceeded. Now, the total ACL is when you add the ACL for the recreational sector with the commercial sector together. So, for example, let's say in 1 year the recreational sector exceeded its ACL, but the commercial sector did not. And when you add the two together, the total landings are lower than the total ACL. In that case, the council is considering not applying AMs in that kind of a situation because the total ACL was not exceeded. Should the council consider AM modifications for other species such as mackerels and cobia? Remember, now the council is shifting management for cobia north of the Florida-Georgia state line to the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, but the council is still responsible for managing cobia on the east coast of Florida. Now, these species are not included in this amendment. Right now, it only includes snapper grouper species and species in that complex, as well as dolphin and wahoo. Mackerels and cobia, their AMs work a little differently, and typically, at least with mackerels, that they have not been exceeding their ACLs for many years. Should the council only consider AM modifications for species whose recreational sector ACLs are routinely being met? So if the ACL is not being met, why mess with them now? However, do you believe that there are advantages for seeking consistency in AMs across species? So if you look at the scoping document, there's a section in there that shows what all the different versions of accountability measures are in effect for all the different snapper grouper and dolphin wahoo species. And there are quite a few. And so the idea was that perhaps maybe one of the things that could be done here is to seek consistency across species. And another concept that the council is considering is whether or not AM should be applied only when a given stock is considered to be overfished. Now, the next area that the council is thinking about taking action has to do with announcing fishing season lengths. The council has been asked to consider announcing the beginning and end of a fishing season before a season begins. And this is already being done for black sea bass and for red snapper. In the case of black sea bass, in the last few years, an ending date for the season has not been given up front because the black sea bass recreational ACL has not been caught up the last several years. So there has been no need for there to be an announced closure. However, red snapper is different. Every year where there is a red snapper season, the recreational seasons, which are 3-day weekends, are announced in advance. So fishermen will know when they can go fish for red snapper and exactly which days. So the pros of this kind of a management strategy is that it would help fishermen with their planning. They'll know not only when does the season open, but when the fishing season will end and what their window is of opportunity for fishing. Now, there are some cons to this as well. It could result in an early closure before the ACL is taken, and this has happened in red snapper, where the ACL wasn't taken because some of the weekends that were allowed for fishing for red snapper was poor weather. And so what the NOAA Fisheries had to do was to announce other weekends later in the year where red snapper could take place. And so a problem it clearly is that estimating how long this season should be, or in the case of like red snapper, what weekends that it could occur, is not always real accurate. And if the council was to go this route, they would have to set a season where they would be pretty certain that the ACL would not be exceeded. So that could result in things like low bag limits to avoid exceeding the ACL, etc. So the council is interested in knowing whether you think that they should consider doing this or not. And if you think they should do it, what other species should they consider this for? And do you think the potential pros outweigh the potential cons? And the last issue that the council is considering in this amendment is one that you might not think a whole lot about, but it could have some implications for how recreational fishers are able to fish. They're considering tracking the ACLs all in the same way. In the recreational fishery, sometimes there's a few species like hogfish where they are tracked in the numbers of fish, where the majority of species are tracked in the numbers of pounds landed. And that's how it's determined whether or not the ACL has been reached. So the pros for tracking numbers of fish are it's easier for the fishermen to understand it's easier to know that, for example, you may have 30,000 fish that you can catch as opposed to 90,000 pounds. And one other thing that is related to this is that if fish are tracked in numbers of fish, and the stock is one that is rebuilding and the size of the fish are getting larger, larger fish weigh more. And so if it's tracked in numbers of fish, you will still be able to catch the same numbers of fish every year. But if it's tracked in pounds of fish, then actually as the stock is rebuilding, you'll be allowed to catch fewer fish because those fish weigh more, but the pounds would perhaps remain the same. And another pro for tracking in numbers of fish is that there will be fewer data conversions. Now, that's not something that generally affects fishermen directly, but it has to do with how numbers are used for stock assessments and tracking landings. So those are the pros for tracking numbers of fish. And the pros for tracking in pounds of fish are things like it would use the same measurement that is being used by the commercial fishery in tracking their ACLs. So what the council would like to know from you is, should all species be tracked the same way as for the recreational fishery? That is, should it be all pounds or should it all be numbers of fish? And if you have an opinion on whether it should be pounds or numbers, the council would like to hear from you on that as well. Now that's all the actions that the council is considering for this amendment. And the proposed timing of the amendment is that we're having some scoping webinar hearings and just allowing scoping comments to come in basically in the month of January. And at their March council meeting, the council is going to review the scoping comments, and they're going to create the actions and alternatives that they want to use. And over the course of the next couple of council meetings, they're going to work on those actions and alternatives and refine them and based on what data analysis shows and input that they have gotten from the public. if everything goes along smoothly, the council could approve this amendment for public hearings as early as June of 2019 at their meeting. If that happens, then the public hearings will likely occur in the summer of 2019. And at their September 2019 meeting, the council will review the public hearing comments and approve all of the actions and alternatives. And then the documents will be finalized and it'll come back to the council in December. The council will take final comments from the public at their December council meeting, and then they will vote on final action to approve the document for secretarial review. Now, this is about as quick as the process could go. It could take longer. So how do you want to, what if you want to comment? How do you go about doing that? Well, first off, there's going to be 2 online scoping webinars on January 23rd and 24th at 6 p.m. Now, you must pre-register for these. It's free. You can do it on your computer before. You need to do that before you can listen or participate in these webinars. And this link on the screen here will help you with that registration for the webinars. Just go to the website for public hearings and scoping meetings for the South Atlantic Council, and you'll see where you can register for the public hearings. Now, if you can comment at the public hearings, but if you don't want to comment at the public hearings, or you're just not able to make it, or you prefer not to do it at that time, you can comment online, and that's actually a preferred method for you to do that. And here's the link on this slide to show you where you can go to comment on this amendment online. And it goes to a form. You'll actually even be able to read all the comments given by other people, the council members, anybody in the public can read those comments. You can also submit your comments by fax, and the number is here on the screen, or you can send your comments by regular mail, and the address to send them to is here. Now, for your comments to be included as part specifically of this scoping session, they must be received by 5 p.m. on February 1st, 2019. You may comment at any time, even beyond that date if you want, but they won't be included as part of the official scoping comment period, but the comments will be available to the council and anybody else who wants to see them after that. The online method, excuse me, the online method should be available beyond the February 1st deadline. Well, that's it. We hope you're going to comment on some of these issues. The council is interested in knowing what you have to say and what you think about how they should handle accountability measures and some other issues related to the snapper, grouper, and dolphin wahoo fisheries. Thank you so much for listening in, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.